Welcome to Framing the Future, a symposium exploring the potential of Web3 technologies to solve big global challenges. We are the Frontier Technologies Hub. We're funded by FCDO, which is the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. And we've been working together to explore the potential for frontier technologies to tackle global challenges. I'm Abby Freeman. I'm co-founder of Brink, and I'm head of futures on the Frontier Tech Hub. I'm going to be your host for today and for the symposium this week.
And I'm Lea Simpson, Brink's other co-founder and innovation director of the Frontier Technologies Hub. It has been my great pleasure to commission research and curate these few days to meaningfully explore the potential of Web3 for global challenges. Now, the first thing that you notice when you start talking to people about Web3 is that they tend to almost immediately fall into one of two camps. First, of course, there are the cynics. And these cynics, they shake their head, they declare Web3 is a flash in the pan. And then, of course, the other camp is what feels a bit more like a maximalist. The maximalists feel like the whole world as we know it is about to be upended because of Web3 and its future applications. I might be giving my age away, but for me, this all feels quite familiar. It reminded me of the early noughties and advancements of the time of Web 2. I remember vividly the optimism that emerged around the promise of Web 2 and it as a kind of community-driven, user-generated web that was powered by innovation. A couple of decades later, and things haven't quite played out the way that those kind of optimists amongst us felt they might have. A couple of decades later, we spend about 8 billion hours a day on platforms that are owned by just 5 companies. It's not hard to wonder, really, how things might have been different if we'd just taken a moment to take stock of our ambitions and to get to know these tools that were kind of emerging at the time. Could we have mapped out a bit more of a thoughtful route to the future if, instead of moving fast and breaking things, we had moved mindfully in order to build better things? At the time, Web 2 was accused by some of being a poorly defined hype bubble. And now, today, these same criticisms are being leveled at Web 3. But the good news is that we're now in a position to learn from history. And we understand, well, I think that if we understand that if we look past the puff and the propaganda, there are probably clues in there that could lead us to a more equitable and desirable outcome with it all. And this is the spirit that brings us here today, and it's the spirit with which we have curated this event today and over the course of the week. So firstly, we are invoking Melvin Kranzberg's first law of technology, that technology is neither good or bad, nor is it neutral. Technology, as far as we're concerned, has no innate qualities, and really it's all about how we shape it that matters. Second, because we can't study something that hasn't happened yet, we're speculating. Much of what we've done together over the course of this summer as a Frontier Technologies Hub with some really talented researchers who you're going to meet is to examine, based on the current examples and the case studies, where it might all end up. The idea is that if we speculate, we could do a kind of hypothetical time traveling exercise and ask, if we woke up in a world that looked like this in a few years' time, in 2 decades' time, what decisions would we wish we had made today? Our promise to you as a Frontier Technologies Hub is that we will call evidence, evidence, and we will call speculation, speculation, but we will be doing a bit of both. And finally, the third kind of principle that's informed how we've curated this week, and this should come as no surprise to anyone who's listening, is that we haven't really felt in any way tempted into this kind of idea of both sidisms. So over the course of this week, you're not going to find a panel discussion where cynics and maximalists come to blows over Dogecoin. Nope. If that's your jam, there are lots of other parts of YouTube that I'm sure will more than satisfy those cravings. Instead, we're here to get into the nuance together, to get beyond the black, the white, the hot, the not, and to consider the maybes together. So hopefully that tees us up nicely for the next 4 days. The thing that I'm most excited about is introducing everyone who attends to this incredible cast of characters that we've met and worked with over the summer. Our team has done some amazing work. They have visited El Salvador to see how making Bitcoin the country's legal tender has impacted everyday life. We have horizon scanned, we've hacked with decentralized communities, and we've analyzed whether we might be able to design Web3 for global security, stability, and prosperity. So thank you very much for joining us if you're here live. Thank you for watching afterwards, if that's what you're doing. And thank you most of all to our colleagues at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office for funding this important work.
So before we get into things, a word first on how it's all going to work. You're here, welcome. We've taken a one-day event and stretched it out across the week this week to give us all a bit of time to reflect in between the sessions on what we're hearing. This should allow you as well to dip in and out of the bits that feel most relevant to you. And also, quite frankly, to make sure we're not zoomed out at the end of a solid day of online sessions. So we're going to be coming together for 2 hours a day, each day from now until Thursday. And we've designed it to take us all on a bit of a journey together. So today we're framing the challenge and we're thinking about, given the attributes of Web3, what are the challenges that it's most suitable for tackling on the face of it? What are the big global challenges that we're facing? I think we all have a solid understanding of that, but how might Web3 technologies provide solutions? Tomorrow, as Lee's already touched on, we're going to be speculating a bit and imagining about the future. We'll be thinking about why speculative design is so useful for solving huge challenges like the global ones that we're facing. We'll be thinking about what might the future hold and what are some alternative visions of that future. Tomorrow, we've got 8 lightning talks. They're called that because they're short and sharp. They're from people who are actively thinking about possible futures for Web3 because they're already working at its frontier. We're going to be hearing from someone using crypto and DAOs for humanitarian work. We're going to be hearing from the creator of a blockchain solution for tracking livestock for farmers across Africa. And we're going to be hearing from the World Economic Forum's Crypto and Sustainability Accelerator lead, Aidan Slavin, who's going to be telling us all about supporting humanitarian and public sector innovations. So you can see people who are really in amongst it already. Then coming back from those potential future scenarios on day 2, by day 3, which is Wednesday, we'll begin to consider what needs to happen now to ensure a positive future. So if we found ourselves in some of those potential future scenarios that we've talked about, what are the things that we would wish we'd done today? We call that exercise of possible scenarios and then looking backcasting. And in that backcasting exercise, we're going to discuss what risks and opportunities and ethical issues should we consider. So on the risks, we're going to hear some insights into things like how governments need to understand the constantly changing landscape of standards in the crypto space. The opportunities, there are many, and we're going to be exploring some, like data self-sovereignty from the UK's digital catapult, or training students in Calabar, Nigeria on migrating Web2 apps into Web3 already. And then there's the whole huge and gnarly world of ethical issues. And to begin to explore that, we're joined by a professor and director of the Centre for Decentralised Digital Economy, who's going to share some provocations on identity, on fake news and misinformation, and whether decentralised tech actually holds potential solutions for these things. So by day 4, given all of that, we should be ready to think about, okay, so what now? Given all we've heard, what are the actions that we need to take now, today? What needs more investigation and investment? Should we even continue to work with Web3 in our organizations? And if so, how should we do that? And we're really honored that on day 4, our closing discussion is with Dame Wendy Hall, Regius Professor of Computer Science at the University of Southampton. And she's also the author of 4 Internets, Data, Geopolitics, and the Governance of Cyberspace. So tune in, same time, same place on Thursday to be joined by her. So you can see that over the 4 days, we're all going to be going on quite a Web3 journey. And our hope is that wherever you are today, wherever you are on your own journey, by the end of your time with us, you'll have hopefully a more nuanced understanding of Web3. I've already used some of the buzzwords like DAO, crypto, blockchain. I'm sure you've heard of NFTs as well. So this could be perhaps your curriculum for helping you make smart decisions for each of those and whether indeed you want to engage in them. And if you do you want to build, buy or borrow? Or perhaps you want to do the 4th B, just bypass them entirely. You'll have a vantage point of hearing from the people who are making stuff, who are designing policies for it and who've gone through a learning journey already themselves. And there's also going to be an opportunity to connect with each other, with your peers in the field, to exchange and perhaps, who knows, even build together. So finally, the practical bit. We are here streaming talks and panel discussions on YouTube Live. We're going to be here each day until 2:45 GMT. And then to help with those connections, there's something a little bit extra. If we were in real life doing this in a room together, Then on your way out of the session, you might grab a coffee with someone. As you're getting your coat, you might exchange views. And that's why towards the end of each session this week, we're going to be sharing a link for a Teams call to give us an online version of that, an opportunity to come together, to connect, to discuss, to perhaps disagree. You might have questions that you still want to address to our speakers and researchers. You might have disagreed with everything that you've heard and want to see if anyone else feels the same way you do. Whatever your views, whatever your opinions, and the questions that you may have still to answer, that chat at the end of the day will be an opportunity for you to connect with others. So I'll wrap up by saying we want to make sure that these sessions are useful to you. So for today and every day this week, here's how you can engage. I can see that you're already commenting and chatting here in the chat box on YouTube, which is great. If you haven't already, then do get stuck in. And to get us started, I'd love to know where you're joining from in the world today. So please do let us know in the chat. I know we've got quite a range of countries joining. Then to engage, you can bring your thoughts and your opinions, your unanswered questions into that Connect conversation. We'll be sharing the Teams link at the end of the session. And finally, you will have already received, when you signed up, a link to the reports from our research process. They'll be shared in the chat again today. So please do take a look at those and tell us what you think.
Great, so let's get started. We promised a day of nuance, and today you're going to meet those who are working on global challenges and hear from them how they kind of conceive and are making sense of all things Web3. To start, we've got a short opening discussion from our colleagues in the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, whose work has been transformative across low middle income countries. Today, we're joined by David Woolnough, who is Deputy Director of Research, Tech and Innovation, and he is going to be interviewing his colleague, Anthony Herman, Team Leader for Tech and Innovation Strategy and Capability at FCDO. After that, we'll be hearing from Alexander McCarroll and Sarah Hamburg. These two are decentralized science experts and one of our research teams who we've been working with this summer. They'll be sharing their findings from an ideathon that they ran as part of this project. And after that, Alex and Sarah will be joined by others who are working in Web3 for all manner of things like education, ecology, and even a generative economy. Then we'll wrap up the session with the Teams link that Abby has just mentioned. But for now, it is my great pleasure to welcome David and Anthony.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you. And I think we're here, well, firstly, just to give you a really warm welcome as well to this symposium from FCDO. But to give you a bit of an introduction, I think we were trying to discuss through how best to do this. So we've decided to do it as a bit of a double act. And we're really keen that actually across the board, in terms of people that are listening, we've got folks that know a lot about this space. We've got folks that know very little. So depending where you are on that spectrum, I think my role in this double act is probably to make you feel better about yourselves if you're there, you don't know very much about Web3. And Anthony's role is to kind of fill you in a little bit more. So we're really just covering a few ideas around why FCDO is interested, why are we involved in this, where do we think it could play a really key role in tackling global challenges. And just, I think, as Lee, as you framed it really nicely, this sort of moving mindfully, how do we get into this issue and frame the challenge, really? So my job is to ask a few very naive questions, and Anthony is going to fill you in on what he can. So I'll kick off without any further ado. So Anthony, so what is Web3?
So Web3 is really a bit of an umbrella term that describes part of the web that runs on blockchain. So unlike Web2, which is controlled by centralized corporations, Web3 is built on peer-to-peer decentralized blockchains. And this blockchain technology enables other technologies like decentralized autonomous organizations or DAOs, smart contracts, cryptocurrencies, and non-fungible tokens or NFTs. And all of these technologies have common qualities of disintermediation, which is a bit of an ugly term, but it means essentially you don't necessarily rely on intermediaries. You can engage peer-to-peer without having to trust the person you're exchanging with. It's intangible. This is technology that lives on the web, and it's decentralized and distributed in its nature. And these are all quite different design principles to what we're familiar with Web 2.
That's great, thanks. So why does it really matter that it's so fundamentally different from Web 2?
Well, so I think these technologies present new opportunities for governance that don't rely on states or corporations needing to be involved. And it can give digital interactions more of the kinds of qualities that the traditional economy has. So, for example, digital assets, things that live in the digital world, you can just replicate them, copy and paste as an example. There's no real scarcity, whereas scarcity characterizes the real world economy. But with blockchain and things like non-fungible tokens, you can create an immutable public ledger of ownership. You can own the rights to something, and you can create exchange without having to have some kind of jurisdiction of a state or corporation assigning those rights to people. And so, as I've said, this enables you to exchange with people you don't necessarily need to trust. For example, with smart contracts, you can agree up front with somebody, you can make an agreement, and you can say that, when some reference point, like the Met Office records a temperature of a certain amount in a certain location, then one party has to pay out an insurance payout of a certain amount. And once you've agreed that with a smart contract, it will just automatically execute when that condition is met. So you then don't have a situation where somebody can default on it, and you don't then have to rely on arbitration and kind of dispute resolution. These are also technologies that have interesting implications for privacy and anonymity. I mean, in some respects, blockchain is generally public, but you can participate anonymously. It can result in all sorts of quite interesting exchanges that we wouldn't see before, things that just purely exist in cyberspace. So you could create an artwork that's digital. You can make it a non-fungible token that you own, and you can then sell it to somebody for cryptocurrency. And that's an exchange that just at no point really involves things that are rooted in the real world, other than the computer networks and so on that are enabling it. So really, it's the tools for a digital native economy that have quite different design principles to the web as we currently know it, and I think that's why it matters.
Yeah, no, that's great. And there's some examples in there you've already picked out around looking at how do we do insurance around weather and things. So you're beginning to sort of flesh out why this is really interesting. We've seen it sort of get adopted in specific areas and niche areas like gaming elsewhere. So where would you, and why might this have potential beyond those niche areas already adopting it? And how much credibility does it have in those spaces?
Well, so I think one major area in which I think it may have real potential, which is an area of real live debate at the moment, is in how data is governed. So with the acceleration of Web 2, we've seen exponential increase in the amount of data being generated by people using the internet. That data has generated enormous wealth by corporations that run the platforms on which most of that data is generated, who then sell that data on. And this, I think data is interesting because it's a bit of a public good in the sense that it's non-rivalrous. You can't use it up. If you use your personal data for one purpose, it doesn't mean that it's going to cost more, isn't going to be available for you to use it for another purpose. But it is excludable. So I guess it's what economists might call a club good. So you can prevent other people from accessing it. But that's enabled corporations that run these platforms to develop the business model whereby they sell this data at a profit. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, there's been a huge amount of innovation in this space. We all benefit from fantastic online services that are free to use, but paid for through the data we're generating. But it has led to calls, for example, last year in the World Bank's World Development Report on Data, for a new kind of social contract on data. And so the World Bank talks about a social contract that would enable the use and reuse of data to create economic and social value, and to ensure equitable access to the value that's realized from that data. And to be able to foster the trust of citizens whose data is being used, that it won't be misused or used for kind of any nefarious purposes. And I think the tools of Web3 offer an alternative way of governing data that could perhaps begin to address this, what the World Bank is calling for, by enabling ownership rights for individuals without an intermediary. I mean, there are some interesting examples already, which I think are in the Web 2 space still, so not strictly what we'll be talking about in the symposium, but for example, Tim Berners-Lee, who created the original World Wide Web, his project Solid is looking at how can users own their data and then license it out to third parties, just whatever small amount of that personal data is necessary for a given service, but have the option to just withdraw that license at any point. There are also lots of ideas in the social media space about different business models. For example, there's a company called We Are 8 that tries to pay its users of that social media platform for looking at adverts and giving them a share in the profits generated from selling on their data. As I've said, these aren't strictly Web3, but I think the tools of Web3 and the design principles of Web3 create opportunities to go even further potentially. And as we look ahead to the AI revolution, which will be fueled by all the data that is being generated, I think it's really important to ask these questions now.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's really helpful actually. And the idea of kind of, we've seen the kind of what the potential of rewriting these social contracts, and actually what's the sort of the big global challenges that have been addressed through the last couple of decades. Actually, when you start to look at what this Web3 could do, tackling some of the global challenges, for example, everyone's in Egypt at the moment, just really focusing in on what can be done around adaptation, what can be done around tackling the different aspects of climate. I mean, these are just huge, and being faced by developing countries who many of whom don't have the connectivity that actually part of this would rely on. Yeah, I guess how might this be relevant for those kind of global challenges in the ODA and on the non-ODA space?
So I think, I mean, it's a great question. Like, when are these features, these design principles, when are they most useful? And I think actually in the circumstances that are prevalent in many countries around the world, there are contexts where these things could really potentially add a lot of value. So, for example, many countries, whether low, medium or high income, will have centralized institutions that aren't trusted or have lost the trust of people, or just simply aren't working. And they're, having a way to operate on a peer-to-peer basis without relying on these institutions can be valuable. And I think an example of that would be, the use of cryptocurrency in Venezuela for remittances or for cross-border exchange when the economy is really in a bad way, and there are all sorts of complexities around embargoes and state interference in the economy. Another example might be when the opportunities to innovate in the physical world are constrained. So in many developing countries, they don't have very developed innovation ecosystems yet, and that's a combination of gatekeepers, rent seeking, corruption, but also low organizational capacity, diffuse skills and talent. It's really hard to get together and collaborate with other people with similar skills and ideas. But being able to do more and more effectively and have these new forms of exchange on the internet could help people to collaborate and be part of communities that aren't really anchored geographically, but are global. So the Ethereum Foundation and the Ethereum community is a good example where it's got people all over the world collaborating to build these new services and these new parts of Web3. Another example would be when the state can't be trusted because it's predatory and because it's states that use citizens' data to persecute its own people. And I think there have been some interesting blockchain use cases already that kind of before we get into Web3. For example, Sila, an app that uses blockchain, allows citizens to upload photos of chemical weapons abuses in Syria as evidence that then is held in a blockchain securely and immutably, but protects their anonymity. And then finally, I think when many people in the world living in poverty, living in low-income countries, for them, every time you have an intermediary, that's another potential profit margin that you're having to pay that has a real cost. So disintermediation, the act of doing away with these intermediaries when they're not needed, can be very efficient and can lead to savings. And that's why we see things like people doing remittances through stable coins, and doing away with the Western Union transfer fees and so on. There's still obviously a transaction cost, but it's less. And finally, I think with something so new, with design principles that are so different as they are with Web3, I think it's so important to have a conversation that brings a diverse group of people together. And in many ways, I think people that living in the global south will be well placed to think outside the box when it comes to this, because there'll be less big tech corporations that can co-opt these sorts of processes. They'll potentially be innovating under pressure, so having to solve acute social problems like poverty and corruption, and so could potentially uncover some of the use cases for Web3 that could be so relevant for global challenges.
Yeah, and I think that last one really brings us on to the final question, which is, I guess, almost who leads on these conversations? Who leads on the development of which of these ideas do we want to run with? Do individuals want to start putting financing behind? Because actually, you mentioned the remittances and almost the explosion of remittances, the work that went on behind mobile money and the revolution of stripping out intermediaries that delivered was very driven by breakthroughs in developing countries in East Africa and elsewhere, rather than determined by the North. So if we're looking at kind of how do we avoid those kind of potential mistakes around there, what should we be cautious about in this? There are so many pitfalls left, right, and centre. What should we be being a bit more mindful about?
You're absolutely right, and I think a key point is that while the technology can make these design principles we've been talking about, while it can make them available, it doesn't guarantee they'll be applied. So Web3 is also a bit buzzword, and there's a lot of hype around it, and it is being used by corporations or to describe technologies and business models that aren't necessarily adhering to any of these principles, and that are actually much more in the realm of the traditional Web 2 and centralized organizations and so on. I think it's also important to note that Web3 is not totally divorced from the physical world or from other traditional centralized phenomena. So, for example, still relies on computer servers. It's still a lot of the cryptocurrency flows are linked to stable coins, which are linked to fiat currencies like the US dollar and so on. And I think so far Web3 is very new. It's still emerging. It's very technical still. It doesn't have great user experience. So it can just get very, very complex and not very open or democratic or transparent for mainstream adoption yet. And we've seen real risks with that, with, for example, the creation of a stablecoin that wasn't collateralized by anything in the real world, the Terra Luna example, which seemed like a really ingenious idea, and lots of people bought into it, but then came crashing down and had real impacts, many people losing huge amounts of money as a result. So there are definitely risks that the complexity brings. I think, you're asking about actors and people who are engaged in this space. And I think on the one hand, there are a lot of these traditional economic interests I've described, who are seeing how Web3 can be used as commercial opportunities. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just important to be aware of that. On the other hand, there are also individuals and ideological communities that are passionate about the principles behind Web3. But those won't all be people committed to social impact or tackling global challenges. There'll be people with controversial political views or some bad actors. And so the ways in which Web3 develops will be shaped by all of the people engaged in this. And that's why I think it's so important that we're having this conversation now, and that we have the opportunity to have this symposium now, while it is still really early days. And we want governments and all of you tuning into this, whether you're in the non-profit sector, whether you're in international development community or international relations and so on, to engage in a debate around it, so that we can shape it, so that when it does emerge, it's something that reflects more diverse sets of inputs and is hopefully something that's more useful and valuable in the work that we do. But David, let me conclude by putting a question back to you, which is what are you most looking forward to learning over the course of this week?
So I'm glad it's that question rather than anything I had to know what I was talking about for. So I think for me it's, and it'll be, we need to switch off this one and actually go on to listening in the mode, is to see the strength of the comments that are coming in from the side in terms of people that are listening, people that are engaged. This idea of actually what are the use cases that genuinely make sense to apply this to. So it's very easy in these areas where you've got a lot of enthusiasts for a particular area to say, right, I've got this hammer, I want to wander around and see what I can hit with it. Actually, to try and get that driven much more from this is what we as a group of organizations who are working in this space, in development in this particular part of the world, are genuinely seeing fits really nicely with the sort of potential that you could unlock with different strands of Web3. So I think I'd look for at the end of this week to get 4 or 5 of those kind of opportunities, so that actually those groups can coalesce around that and actually start to really define and shape that for those priority, I guess, low-hanging use cases. That would be my ask. And I think finally then, before I hand back to Abby and Lee, how about you then, Anthony? What would you like to get out of this week?
Yeah, I think I would echo. I think for me, it would be really getting familiar with some of the examples that are emerging and some of the use cases that are relevant for the work that we do in tackling global challenges. I think a lot of the mainstream attention so far has been on early use cases that are more linked to gaming and commercial interests and so on. But I know we have a lot of really interesting innovators involved this week and people who are working on some really new ideas. And so I'm really excited to learn more about all of that.
Wonderful. Anthony, thank you so much. Abby, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you so much, David and Anthony from FCDO, for that excellent exploration to get us started. Many things for us to bear in mind there. We've just heard, just some of the attributes that are particular to Web3 that help us begin to understand what kinds of global challenges it might be most suitable for tackling. We heard quite a few there from what a digital economy without intermediaries might mean, different dynamics, data issues and the new business models around data. That there were quite a few there in your talk, so thank you for that provocation. It's striking too about how different the design principles are for Web3, and Anthony, what you're saying there about the opportunity for thinking outside the box was a really interesting one, and of course some risks and some pitfalls there for us to bear in mind, including around diversity. And actually we've had some really interesting and excellent conversations coming in the chat. From Shane Dillon, thank you for sharing that one. From Sam Adams Winterill, thank you for yours. And Erica Neve has a great question sparked by that part of the discussion around diversity. So please do keep the questions coming in the chat. We're going to be picking those up in the panel and beyond. Now, if you want to know about the best applications for Web3, you're probably best off asking people who are already playing, working and dreaming in this space all the time. And that's exactly what Sarah Hamburg and Alexandra McCarroll did in an Ideathon they ran as part of the research they did with us on the topic. So it's my pleasure to introduce now Alexandra and Sarah from Phase 3, a decentralized innovation foundry based at UCL. They're now going to share a download of their research from the Web3 community.
Hi, I'm just waiting for the slides to come up. Yeah, thanks, cool. Okay, so hi, I'm Alex, co-founder of Phase 3, an innovation consultancy focused on innovation and Web3 technologies. Thank you for coming along today. We've loved being part of this amazing team, looking into the potential impact of Web3 in the context of international development. For the next half hour, we're going to be exploring the potential of Web3 to tackle big global challenges through the themes of supporting sustainable economies, climate change and the protection of nature, female empowerment and protection, humanitarian response, and global health. This was the framing for ID3, which then Sarah will take you through the outputs of. It was an Ideathon we hosted, and we also did a broader analysis of this Ideathon and the potential implications. So Web3 projects relating to supporting sustainable economies are wide-ranging, from implementing universal basic income to help alleviate poverty, to providing microfinance to entrepreneurs in developing countries. For example, Impact Market have provided UBI, which is universal basic income, to communities such as a remote village located in northeast Brazil. This is where families lack access to basic resources such as food and water. Since the community started to benefit from UBI distributed through Impact Market, the whole village has been positively impacted by the financial inclusion and empowerment driven by the UBI program. This has helped to develop the local microeconomy based on small businesses. Blockchain enables us to reach those who have been underserved by traditional financial systems. Other Web3 native projects, such as Blockchain for Humanity, provide new technologies to sustain innovative business models that are rooted in the social context of disadvantaged but vibrant communities. Furthermore, in 2020, the Human Rights Foundation launched a fund to support software developers who are making the Bitcoin network more private, decentralized, and resilient, so that it can serve as a financial tool for human rights activists, civil society organizations, and journalists around the world. UNICEF are also leveraging blockchain for financial inclusion, particularly around creating digital tools for people to access decentralized financial instruments, marketplaces, and decision-making mechanisms. In 2019, the UNICEF Crypto Fund was launched, which provides new financial vehicles enabling UNICEF to receive, hold, and disperse cryptocurrency, allowing them to explore what it means to operate in a highly digitally financed future. As you can see some examples here where people have raised money in crypto. So next is climate change and the protection of nature. There are many Web3 projects relating to the theme of this. They sit within the regenerative finance, also known as the ReFi movement, which aims to promote sustainability goals, and thus far is predominantly focused on carbon markets and community stewardship of natural resources. Prominent examples of ReFi projects include ClimaDAO, a digital currency backed by carbon assets, and Toucan Protocol, who are connecting the voluntary carbon market to Web3. You can actually read more about this if you just look this up online. There's a few articles. I think there was a Time article about this. So other ReFi work with local communities seek to empower those communities. Gitcoin grants is a key resource of funding for grassroots projects, and Gitcoin started as a platform where software developers could get paid for their work on open source software, because this previously wasn't very possible, it was very disjointed. So users can submit their own project ideas to the platform in order to crowdsource funding from donors. It's now used to fund various types of projects, including ReFi initiatives. Web3 projects relating to the theme of female empowerment and protection are generally lacking compared to other themes, and this correlates with the majority of those working in Web3 being male identifying. So an important aspect of Web3 is attracting more diversity into the space to actually work on these problems. So there's many initiatives to help improve this gender balance. This includes projects focusing on amplifying female voices, hosting hackathons to help women start building Web3 solutions, and onboarding women into Web3 through financing and education. There are also many Web3 efforts focused on funding of educations for girls using cryptocurrency donations. Girls Who Code is actually quite an interesting example. They've taught computer science skills to roughly 500,000 girls across the world, and they've raised over $100 million in total from some of the largest organizations like Apple, Microsoft, Walmart. They're now accepting crypto donations. Another example includes Black Girls Code, who are introducing coding to young girls from underrepresented communities. And they've received about $80,000 in Gitcoin grants to date. In 2021, a global report on women and cryptocurrency highlighted the power of Web3 to provide financial independence to women. The team interviewed 60 women from 31 countries. with 68% of respondents from non-developed nations. The majority had lived through a crisis involving high inflation, currency devaluation, and crippling debt and/or financial isolation. It was concluded that these experiences inspired them to pursue their own financial independence through cryptocurrencies. Over a third of respondents also reported having experienced a financial crisis in their country, such as repetitive currency devaluations. These experiences inspired their interest in Bitcoin and other digital assets. In some cases, respondents from Argentina and Venezuela were numb to the exhaustion of managing chaos on a regular basis. They were laser focused on addressing what was in their direct control, as they were unable to rely on government instability. Another interesting point about this is lots of women are not able to open bank accounts in some of these countries. So having a crypto account was one of the only ways to do this. Recent humanitarian crises, including COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine, have catalyzed the use of Web3 in humanitarian response. The majority of these efforts have focused on cryptocurrency donations for humanitarian relief. Most notably, the donation of around $1 billion from Ethereum's co-founder Vitalik Buterin to an Indian COVID relief fund in 2021. This included 500 ETH and 50 trillion meme coins called Shiba Inu. Furthermore, at the start of the war in Ukraine, the government began accepting cryptocurrency donations. By March 2022, Ukraine had received over $100 million in cryptocurrency. The majority were received into a main fund run by a Ukrainian crypto exchange called Kuna. This is assisting the government in converting the crypto into fiat. This has been primarily used to fund food, gas, medical supplies, firearms for civilians, and civilian evacuations. There's also a second wallet run by the Ministry of Digital Transformation, which is helping fund the army. The ministry has also launched an NFT collection to help with this funding. It was first announced in early March. The NFT collection, actually called the Meta History Museum of War, you can see on the slide, is now live. The collection is an NFT museum documenting the history of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's comprised of about 559 NFTs so far, documenting the events of the first 100 days of the war. Illustrations are done by Ukrainian and international artists, and each one references a tweet documenting some aspect of the invasion and the world's response to it. Now let's explore how Web3 projects are tackling the theme of global health. Many of these projects sit within the decentralized science or DeSci movement, which is predominantly focused on data and AI and the biotech sector, which is quite interesting what Anthony was saying about the data side, because there's a lot of work that's being done on this. Looking at projects out of institutions such as Protocol Labs is an example of such. The DeSci movement aims to enhance funding, scientific funding, unleash knowledge from silos, eliminate reliance on profit-hungry intermediaries, such as publisher conglomerates, and increase collaboration across the field. There are active communities established across the globe, including in Europe, North America, China, Japan, and Brazil. There is also a DeSci conference happening in London at the Francis Crick Institute on the 15th and 16th of January next year. If you would like to learn more, you can visit desci.london. And one of the most established organizations in the space, called Molecule, is using Web3, particularly IP NFTs, to expedite the development of novel therapeutics. Some communities, such as crowd-funded cures, are also experimenting with Web3-based impact bonds to incentivize clinical trials for off-patent therapies. Longevity is a key area of focus in the Web3 health space, and this is related to the potential impact across multiple diseases. VitaDAO is a particularly large and relatively established DAO, already funding longevity research in universities across the world, including at Newcastle University here in the UK. Next, we'll hear from Sarah about IE3.
Thanks very much, Alex. Hi, everybody. It's really exciting to be here. So as Alex mentioned, I'm going to talk to you about ID3, which was our Ideathon event that we ran. So it's a 48-hour event for international development and Web3. And the aim was to crowdsource ideas for Web3 from the international development and Web3 communities. So participants formed teams, and then they were given a guide at a kickoff event. And the guide outlined key themes, which were taken from the UK's international development strategy. And the guide also included ideation tasks that teams were asked to work through over the 48 hours. And we had 4 dedicated prizes. So these were best use of Web3 technology to solve a problem, greatest involvement of Web3 communities, most thorough exploration of risks, and most inspiring idea. So we had 38 people sign up and 7 teams which submitted their projects. We also had some really amazing talks from Seb Mahatre, Kendra Leong, and Ale Border, and you can actually watch those on our YouTube channel. So yeah, thank you. Next slide, good. So the report that details all the submissions will be made available, but as an overview for now, the award for best use of Web3 was won by a project called Biocommerce, which proposed an international on-chain market for biological materials. The idea was this would enable transparent and streamlined trading and shipping. The most inspiring idea was awarded to CureDAO, who proposed a data-driven Web3 solution to support precision health. And the award for the greatest involvement of relevant communities went to a project called Failsafe, who focused on crypto research, reporting, and journalism. So the other projects included PureDAO, which proposed a solution for landfill clearance, leveraging Web3 for decentralized governance and crowdfunding. There was one called Investing in Your Fitness, which aimed to tackle obesity with a move to earn model. Curation DAO focused on Web3 to support artists. And then finally, there was a project which focused on decentralized data for women's health, particularly looking at women's sexual and reproductive health in developing countries. So after the event, we then followed up the projects 10 weeks later. And here's just an overview of a few of what they've been working on since. So Biocommerce, they were the project who won best use of Web3 to solve a problem. So they've since won a grant worth $1,000 US from an organization called Algovera, algovera.ai. If anybody's interested, they're looking at decentralized AI, building an organization around that. And the grant was to fund work on mapping microclimates and species strains. And then what the team are going to do is they're going to create an open source repository with this data so that anybody can build on it. And we at Phase 3 are continuing to help guide the project in this. CureDAO have been very busy building since, so they've created a vault for what they call digital twin data, which is like your health data. They've made an NFT-based authorization system to access the data. They've also made a no-code health app builder, and they've updated the solutions, APIs, and architecture as well. And then finally, the Women's Health Data Project. So they've actually already started a pilot in Uganda, and they're continuing to work on this. Interestingly, they've refined their target data, and they said that this was actually influenced by discussions around risks during the Ideathon event. And they're now focusing specifically on menstrual cup use for promoting a range of different outcomes, including school attendance. And they're working in partnership with an NGO in Uganda for this. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the broader analysis of the event itself and the submissions that we had. So first of all, a bit of a gap analysis. So we provided 5 different international development themes, and the most popular of these was supporting sustainable economies, followed by global health. No projects address the theme of humanitarian response. So this is quite surprising due to the rise of cryptocurrencies for this purpose, as Alex mentioned earlier, notable examples being COVID relief in India and also the war in Ukraine. Interestingly, COVID response was also missing from the submissions, and that's despite many of the submissions focusing on global health and also the recent rise of decentralized biotech, as Alex mentioned earlier. So the most prolific theme in Web3 is decentralized finance, or DeFi. However, we didn't actually see any DeFi projects in the submissions, although investing in your fitness touches on DeFi with its move to earn model. So it's possible that people didn't really see DeFi fitting within international development, or maybe people just wanted to explore something a bit different during the event. In terms of the tasks that we gave people, the exploration of risks was a key component of the event. So we had like a dedicated prize for this. However, the judges all agreed that the attempts for this were generally quite poor across all entries, and so we decided not to actually award that prize, and instead we distributed the funds across the remaining 3 prizes. So we think that this kind of suggests that teams particularly struggle with this form of thinking around risks. Interestingly as well, most projects had a global focus, and they weren't necessarily targeted at any one particular country or location-based community. We also found the involvement of relevant communities was a fairly strong element across many projects, but the details were generally lacking. And also details were generally lacking on how impact would be measured. So this is things like KPIs. And obviously evaluation's a very big component of traditional international development. You know, we dedicate long time scales and large percentage of budgets to this. And considerations like this were generally missing from the submissions. We also thought the evaluation of Web 2 alternatives was quite poor. Where it was mentioned, it wasn't really clear why the benefits of blockchain were necessary beyond Web 2 versions, which again suggests that teams might struggle explaining why Web 3 is really necessary. And finally, projects were explicitly asked if their idea could meet the digital public good standard. Only 2 teams answered this, and both vaguely suggested that it could. So as mentioned, projects generally struggled with the task of exploring risks. So we just wanted to highlight some important considerations that we would have liked to see explored. Not limited to this, but here's kind of like 6 key risks here that we wanted to highlight today. So one potential big risk is the ethical and legal issues related to putting personal data on chain. So for example, health data. And that's a key theme that we do see across DeSci as well. There's obviously risks around using emerging Web3 based tools because these are largely untested, you know, privacy preserving tools, things like that. There's the exploitation of vulnerable people through incentives. So this might be something like selling your personal data, or even incentivizing people to just spend their time participating in a DAO. If they're vulnerable people, that potentially could be questionable. We didn't really see that much detail around the work that's potentially required to actually comply with or help change existing regulations and coordinate global stakeholders. And so there's obviously a lot of risks involved if your solution is going to depend on doing those things. Token speculation risks, these were mentioned in a couple of projects, but where they were mentioned, we felt they were maybe minimized somewhat. And there's also risks around DAO governance and accountability. So as yet, there aren't really any good examples of DAOs working well in these areas. So any DAO potentially has risks there. So interesting question. Well, how representative are the ideas that we got in the ID3 event of the wider Web3 ecosystem? So as mentioned, there are large relevant components of the Web3 ecosystem missing from the submissions. So this is Web3 for humanitarian response and also DeFi itself. But many of the submissions did touch on other key themes that have emerged over the past couple of years. So as Alex talked about earlier, regenerative finance or refi, you know, for example, Pure DAO, which was about landfill clearance, would fit within this, and also decentralized science. So we had about 4 submissions which could sit within this. So for example, biocommerce and Cure DAO, which I mentioned earlier. Also, as international development falls within Web3 for public goods, these refi and DeSci related submissions are actually highly representative of these current trends. So next, I'm going to talk about implications. So implications for Web3 communities first. Well, based on the entries from our event, it seems that these communities would probably benefit from support thinking through risks and impact evaluation. So we think tools or working groups could be established to help with this. Also, the ability for Web3 entrepreneurs to connect with government mentors and advisors would likely be really beneficial for both parties. We also think that Web3 communities would benefit from awareness and support around existing relevant tools and standards, you know, things like the Digital Public Good Standard. And since the event, some projects have won funding from the Web3 ecosystem. So as I mentioned before about biocommerce. And so a program of small government grants could really help guide projects in executing safe and effective pilots. And we think that could be useful. Also, I just wanted to note that investment in the Web3 ecosystem through prizes or investment, it often catalyzes further innovation. And this is illustrated really well from a quote that we had from the biocommerce team, who were the winners of Best Use of Web3. I plan on using the prize to contribute to the next round of Gitcoin grants, as it seems that is the best way to pay it forward. Alex mentioned Gitcoin a little bit earlier. And the biocommerce team are also using their recent grant from Algovera to create an open source mapping of microclimates and species strains, which further catalyzes work in this area for others to build upon. So implications for Web3 and international development. Well, the submissions indicate there's a strong interest in health and the environment within Web3 communities. A key component of many submissions was around maintaining personal data privacy whilst leveraging Web3. So we feel that global standards to ensure safe methods to achieve this are necessary because they're currently lacking. Also through this work, it has become quite apparent that there's a divergence between the language of traditional international development and the language of Web3, despite describing similar things often. So for example, public goods and impact DAOs in Web3 will often align with international development. So ReFi relates to climate change and protection of nature. DeSci often relates to global health. There's also an interesting divergence in the more location-based mindset of traditional international development and the global Web3 mindset, where nation states are secondary to digital communities. So to further catalyze Web3 for international development, it's likely going to be beneficial to try and close the gap in these areas, possibly by revisiting language and terms that we use, and even shifting the emphasis away for international development, away from very specific geographical locations towards communities who are united by common problems and needs. And then last but not least, policy and regulation. So governments are obviously a turning point where they're going to have to make decisions about Web3 policy and regulation. And there's many different aspects to this, decisions around taxation, data protection, accountability, identity. So decisions must simultaneously protect citizens and national interests whilst furthering technological innovation and global development. And each country will balance these in their own way according to their priorities and risk appetites. So we think that key takeaways for policy and regulation from our work here include, as I mentioned, the potential benefits of revisiting language and mental models associated with traditional international development to help close those gaps with Web3 and catalyze work at this new intersection of international development and Web3. Also, the need for global policies and standards, like I mentioned, for handling personal data in Web3. We feel it would be incredibly beneficial for the UK to help establish cross-border working groups on these issues. And then finally, the UK could take inspiration from countries like Japan, for example, whose digital ministry are reported to be launching their own DAO to learn more about how they work. So thank you very much for listening to our talk. It's a pleasure to be here, and please do reach out with any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you so much to you both, Alexandra and Sarah. We're going to be hearing more from you in the panel as you're joined by other guests imminently. Before we go to the panel, I see we've been having questions coming in the chat. Thank you to Shaneen Bihari, Shane Dillon and more for your questions. To everyone listening in, this is your opportunity to ask questions. If you've got questions for our panelists, pop it into the chat. Lee's going to draw on them so that our guests can answer either in the panel or directly in the chat. So do keep your questions coming. And we have a hashtag. If you're live tweeting or if you're want to follow along on Twitter, we have the hashtag FTWeb3. That's FTWeb3 on Twitter. And so I'm going to pass over to the panel now and to Lee, who's going to be introducing it.
Great. Thank you, Abby, and huge thanks to Sarah and Alex, who are going to be joined by a wonderful panel of other speakers. And, you know, at the top of the day, we promised you stories from those who are working and imagining and dreaming in Web3. This panel will not disappoint. And if it's okay, I'm going to jump straight in, if I may. Andreas Beaver, you are co-founder of Urban Emerge. You are working towards inclusive, ecological, and circular development. What did you make of Sarah and Alex's presentation and their findings? Does it chime with your experience? And if I may, it would be wonderful to learn a little bit from you about how you are tackling specifically evaluation and risks, given so much of the work that you do is in development. So maybe kick us off.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lee, and it's great to be a real honor to be on this panel. So I'm Andreas Beaver. I manage a consultancy called Urban Emerge. We focus on digital solutions for sustainability, among other things. So to your question, I thought that was an excellent question. Thanks very much, Sarah and Alexandra. And it does resonate with a lot of the things that we've been thinking about and helping clients to research to understand the applications of some of the Web3 approaches in development work, in sustainable development. So I think there are three particular areas that I can bring my own experience to, which I think combines very well with what the previous speakers were talking about. And the first of those is the voluntary carbon market and the application of Web3 to help improve efficiencies there. The second one is around supply chains, sustainable supply chains. And the third one is more about the ability to help channel funding to more community-based conservation projects or nature-based solutions. And I think across all of those, there's real potential, but also real challenges that we've seen, and we can explore, I'm sure, through this panel and through the following 3 days. So, for example, with voluntary carbon markets, there's a lot in terms of the role of Web3 to help to really. So, for example, if you have a project that has a carbon reduction impact, traditionally they would go through a standards body like the Gold Standard or Verra, which is a kind of gatekeeper of standards and quality. Now, there's a problem there because it takes a long time. There's a huge backlog of projects. There's limited resources to deal with such a growing number of projects in this space. And so the role for Web3 is to turn to blockchain to be able to have a trusted verification process for how a project can generate impact and where the carbon credit can go. And there's another layer in terms of tokenizing carbon credits and then being able to trade those. So not to go into too much detail, I think there's a lot there. And as a big part of that, there's a huge role of verifying impact and kind of evaluating what a project is doing. And there are pros and cons, I think, where you're thinking about the role of Web3 there. Some of the pros are you can have a kind of results-based payment system, which is connected to non-fungible tokens and the release of funds to a specific project if a result is achieved. And the result could be something that could be verified automatically as well via satellite imagery and machine learning analysis and that kind of thing. But there are challenges as well, because we've heard quite a lot recently of how some carbon credit projects are not achieving their desired impact, and in fact they're a failure in terms of carbon reduction, but actually they're still kind of there's a huge amount of money still passing through the project implementers. So I think there's a lot to dig into. I'll stop there.
That's a really great introduction, and I'd like to just zoom in a little bit more on carbon markets in particular. You've touched on verification, you've touched on efficiencies. Of course, today we're also joined by John Hoops from Toucan, and Wired Magazine happened to call Toucan and its work the blockchain designed to reinvent the carbon credit market. So let's pick up where Andreas left off on carbon credits in particular. And I'd love to hear from you, John. More than efficiencies, more than verification, how optimistic are you? What's in store?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Lea. Thanks for having me. So for those of you who aren't familiar, at Toucan Protocol, we're building the financial rails to unlock climate action at scale. And to do this, we're really kind of zeroing in on what we see as a key kind of leverage point in the system, which is really the sort of digital infrastructure on which carbon credits are registered and transacted, right? This registry. This is kind of on the basis of a couple of years of research that some of my co-founders did, looking at how carbon financing works with their Web3 hat on, right? So I think maybe it's worth kind of mentioning, I really think of blockchains as being useful when you think on the level of markets rather than individual market actors, right? So they're useful in situations where a wide range of stakeholders need to coordinate and transact, and those stakeholders don't necessarily fully trust each other or aren't fully coordinated, right? So we started looking at this idea of how do we build a better registry, which we see as the digital infrastructure that underpins a carbon credit throughout its entire value chain. So just as Andreas was kind of talking about, there's the sort of financing, planning, kind of pre-issuance process that leads up to a project actually getting off the ground. Then there's a process of analyzing, assessing, and verifying the credibility of the climate impact that the project is creating. And then on the basis of that analysis, carbon credits are issued. And our ultimate vision is to create this sort of coordination layer to sit underneath the value chain of a carbon credit so that we can, exactly as Andreas said, kind of find efficiencies in the market and improve the trust and integrity that people have in carbon markets as we scale. I really kind of key in on this concept of waste in carbon markets, right? There's a lot of waste through friction points, through extractive financial intermediaries. A lot of intermediaries do play an important role, and then sometimes they're taking more than they really need to. And so that's really kind of the essence of what we're looking at, is how can we use this next generation financial infrastructure in the form of blockchains and smart contracts to reduce the amount of waste that's created in carbon markets so that we can unlock more capital flowing to climate impact projects at scale.
And John, as you were chatting, a really great comment and question has come in from Alejandro Solis in the chat. He says, we're clear on what can be traced on-chain, but the main problem is what you can't verify off-chain, where local organizations and certificators, including remote sensing, fit. Do you want to answer that while you're in phone?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a key point that we're really leaning into heavily here. Blockchain is not a panacea, right? This is not, oh, put it on a blockchain and everything's fixed. We still kind of suffer from a lot of the challenges, or face a lot of the challenges, all of the challenges that the incumbent market faces. And our role is to really provide a technical infrastructure that kind of has a lot of these, inherits a lot of the benefits of Web3. So very high integrity from a data storage perspective, right? We get access to a new range of governance tools that are being developed by the digital governance work, DAOs and digital governance. We also have a really big one is actually connecting into the decentralized finance world, right? So as a token, because smart contracts are composable and can seamlessly plug into other smart contracts, carbon credits that have been tokenized suddenly have access to this whole range of new financial functionality that's coming online and really developing quickly. It plugs into centralized science systems that Sarah and Alex are working on. So no, I think there's definitely a very hefty dose of humility that we need to have, which is a lot of really smart people have been working really hard to improve carbon market integrity for a long time, and we're not coming along with new solutions. What we do have is some advanced new tools that might help the market find those solutions a bit more quickly. And ultimately, that's kind of what this is about, right? Is increasing the integrity and transparency of the voluntary carbon market so that it can scale more quickly, so that it can bring down the Keeling curve and decarbonize the atmosphere more quickly and kind of head off some of these most severe climate forecasts.
Great, thank you. And please do keep the chat and the comments coming in the chat if you're following along. It's really interesting to me. A lot of discussions around Web3 do tend to kind of find a center of gravity around this idea of an infrastructure, which is way more simpler to think about when you're looking at, finance or supply chains. But I would love to bring in Taylor Kendall from Learning Economy next, because I know that he is working in education, and he is also working on what he calls the kind of plumbing in education systems, and thinking about how Web3 might play a role there. So talk to us about a different kind of infrastructure, Taylor. And I understand you're going to stay off camera because your connection's a bit choppy, but we can hear you. So yeah, tell us, what are you up to?
Yeah, thanks, Lee, and others. I know this. There's plenty that goes into organizing events like this, certainly virtual. So appreciate the time and the work that's gone into this point. And thanks for the other panelists for joining. Yeah, you know, infrastructure is one of these words that sort of, in some ways, means everything and often gets lost and means nothing. But I think at the end of the day, you know, Web3 really does have, and again, Web3 being also a term that can mean a lot of things and also nothing because it's broad and has different meanings across contexts. But crypto, blockchain, emerging technology, we like to just really hone in on the idea that the evolution of the internet does have an impact on societies and the way we operate. And so at Learning Economy, yeah, the goal is to really think about how these technologies ultimately impact systems that sit underneath education and really translate them into new systems that promote equity, mobility, and yeah, at the end of the day, individual agency and really look to improve lives by way of, you know, yes, translating some of what's important about the technology from sort of a pedagogical lens, but also quite literally rethinking, you know, the systems themselves. So more practically speaking, that comes in the form of interesting new underlying standards and protocols that often right now turn into sort of things like digital wallets and means of owning and controlling our own sort of credentials and skills, new agents, governance mechanisms, being more efficient with decision-making processes. DAOs certainly fit into that bucket. And also just, you know, bringing sort of all that is great about current digital infrastructure when we think of just sort of Web 2 and really merging it and finding bridges that can sort of cross chasms between sort of Web 2 traditional systems and what, you know, these new sort of trust-based infrastructures and architectures ultimately afford. So that's, I know, very high level.
How is that applying to Web3 and the work that how is that applying to the world of education? Because a lot of what you've described is kind of sector agnostic description of what might be possible. So what are you piloting? What are you experimenting with at Learning Economy?
Yeah, right now the sort of key focus moving into next year is sort of public good infrastructure around that digital wallet and exploring skills and credentials as quite literal currency in different ecosystems. So we have an open source project called LearnCard, which you can take a peek at learncard.com. And right now we have 2 or 3 pilots, one with Lego Foundation, exploring the application of that with children, and then others in sort of a post-secondary or university context that really provides more just agency and ability for students and learners, regardless of whether that's in a traditional setting or more non-traditional, to have access and control over the things they're learning and translating those skills or those credentials quite literally as currency into opportunity, whether that's a job or you know, internships, other things. So yeah, right now it's sort of at the digital wallet stage, but we also see that as sort of step one to a broader suite of sort of public goods and again, deeper underlying infrastructure as these things start to sort of come together into one.
Great. So you kind of imagine a world in which we can take our credentials with us, which, yeah, and in which those credentials are interoperable. It feels like a very exciting piece of work to be doing. I am wondering, Bian Lee, as co-founder of the Hungry Lab, you know, we've been talking about DAOs, we've been talking about infrastructure, we've been talking about supply chains. Is this resonating for you? I know that so much of your work is around individual drive, passion that individuals have to do purposeful work. I know that you're very interested in the future of work. Bring the human component into this kind of technical mix, if you would, and tell us what you see and how this is chiming for a kind of new generation of workers.
So in terms of the human part, which is a great you know, thing that you mentioned, is we call it technology with humanity, right? Because technology with just without applied innovation into sustainable development and the right deployment really doesn't mean much, and it's not very impactful. And so what we do at the Hungry Lab is we're a global innovation, education, and startup incubation platform, and we focus on building up the next generation of not just founders and entrepreneurs, but the next generation of learners and organizations that are creating not just a resilient future, but a regenerative one. And that's where we're moving to. And we see a lot of parallels in terms of the regenerative economy, whether it's regenerative investing, regenerative education, learning, and impact. These key aspects follow a lot of the parallel principles of the fundamental aspects of Web 3.0, which is decentralization. No longer is education or funding or entrepreneurship being needing to have gatekeepers, right? And so it's bringing that collaborative spirit. It's increasing the collaborative spirit of what we do. So decentralization is key, and especially when you're looking at sustainable development and collaboration around the world, innovative ideas, people are much more able to share, especially when you're looking at traceability and reliability and transparency. And with the governance aspect, that's number two. And consensus-based, it's agile, and it's very much geared towards privacy as well. And the immutability of the technology is key. And so people can get, credit for their work. It is on the blockchain. They can get paid for their work. And so you're also increasing opportunities for people to improve their livelihoods by opening up additional economic channels for them. And so that's also something that's very important. And in terms of for sustainability, this opens up a wide range of avenues for even individual citizens to be able to make an impact and participate in terms of, contributing their ideas as making an income and greater collaboration. And especially when you look at data, and when data becomes more accessible, it levels the playing field, and it's no longer held back by gatekeepers, by big institutions. And so more people are able to contribute their ideas towards building a sustainable future. So I'm very optimistic in terms of how this technology, if deployed, in the right way with the right people, it's all, at the end of the day, it's for people, right? It's still by people and it's still for people. And if we still can keep in mind that aspect, then I think it does have a lot of potential, especially when we're looking at, there's more awareness of the energy offsets required for this type of technology. We have digital carbon credit coins now, and there's a lot that can be done with the data to improve smallholder livelihoods, the bottom of the pyramid when we talk about sustainable development, like being able to process a lot of data sets, like for our a lot of the ag tech companies we work with, processing crop data, field data, satellite data, to be able to provide precision diagnostics for farmers and those types of things that are critical for the smallholders. And so I think this does offer and open up a lot more areas for collaboration and innovation, as long as we keep in mind that, as to echo what John said, that this technology is not a panacea, and it requires communication, it requires collaboration in the ecosystem, and it requires us to understand that we need to peel back the noise, because there are a lot of buzzwords, right? And people get excited and hyped up about a lot of these buzzwords, but when you peel back the noise and you get to the fundamental structure, or as what Taylor said about the pipes and the plumbing of it, right? The actual infrastructure, and look at the fundamental aspects. How do we deploy these key attributes, these positive characteristics of decentralization, governance, privacy, into human-based ecosystems in the real world?
Well, let's talk about that a bit, because I'm really pleased that you were talking about, this is by people, this is for people, but for who? And Alex and Sarah, just before we joined the panel, we're talking about the lack of diversity and the people kind of making with this stuff. Mm-hmm. So I'd love to pick up on a comment that Nick Moore has left in the chat. And he's asked specifically a question for John, but I think I'd be interested in hearing what you think, or Andreas, if you'd like to come in and answer. So how do we explore extending the use of these technologies to more low-tech communities. So how do we get low-tech communities into DAO's blockchain certification? And are you focusing on these lower tech communities or those who might be more marginalized? And how do we make sure that the future is more equally distributed? So who of you would like to come in? Maybe John, since the question was directed at you, I'll start with you and then invite others to chip in if they have other things to add.
Yeah, so I think we've been making a big mistake in the Web3 community for the last several years by leading with the technology, right? I use a bunch of apps. I don't know if they're on AWS or Google Cloud Platform. I don't know if they use a MongoDB or PostgreSQL. Like, this is all technical details that the engineering team needs to worry about that are abstracted away through the user interface. And I think that I'm really excited to see applications built where the back end is a blockchain and it has a lot of the functionality and reliability and resiliency that blockchains can offer, but the end users don't need to know. Maybe they can opt in to say self-custody of assets, but they kind of that Web 2.5 play. And I think really, like, what does this look like? It looks like, yeah, mobile applications. It looks like people being able to manage their assets on their phone, just like they have a neobank, Monzo. It's the same concept with a crypto wallet. It could be, yeah, I mean, the question is a bit tricky because it really depends on the application, right? I know of some, there's actually in the report that was referenced in the kind of by Brink and the team that was putting this together, talked about some of these insurance products for smallholder farmers where they can get their payments very quickly. And it kind of means that the insurance industry can address a large sector of the market that wasn't profitable for traditional insurers to go after because they live in remote communities. They tend to not be like large revenue volumes, but they still can really benefit from having things like crop insurance. And that's as simple as a mobile application on a smartphone or even on a older mobile phone, where they have their numbers and they can send money back and forth. It might mean that application developers need to make a couple of trade-offs on their decentralization maximalism, because and for example have, say, some kind of organization running a server that holds private keys on behalf of the users and kind of manages their assets for them. But to me, that kind of a trade-off is, if it's done thoughtfully, a really, really well worth it. And I think that's it. It's because a lot of the challenges with Web3 is a user experience challenge around some of the technical requirements of interacting with these systems. And I think there's more and more coming along at many different layers of the technical stack to bring those barriers down.
So consider the user interface and Web3 is the kind of behind the scenes, and people shouldn't even know that they're interacting with a thing called Web3. And
yes.
Andreas, and
so can I just caveat that though to say there are certain principles that a lot of Web3 applications do kind of adhere to. To me, one of the main kind of values behind Web3 is that Web3 applications are designed to put the user at the center of the equation rather than the platform provider. And so it's not quite so simple as, well, just pull out a server and put in a blockchain and it's all the same, because the application designer could still kind of build in some ways in which I abuse some of the human rights of the users. And instead kind of thinking about, okay, how can we adopt the core principles of Web3 and some of the values we want to embed in our technical systems, but also make it easier and familiar for users to interact with through kind of processes that they're familiar with just by being Web2 users. Now, and I also caveat that, like, this doesn't necessarily address people who don't have smartphones, and that's a big
exactly. And that's why I'd love to go to Andreas, who is working in specifically more developing contexts. So I think, the vision that John outlined is quite compelling, and it's great to see the rest of the panelists kind of nodding along. But so what if you are, in a rural village somewhere outside a place like Nairobi, or a big city where connectivity, the cost of data, access to the internet, access to electricity might not be available? Like, are there other ways and means of distributing this kind of technology far and wide? And are you doing this in your own work?
Yeah, thanks, Leah. Digital inclusion is such an important aspect everywhere as we move forward with all of these kind of solutions. And there's a lot that can be done to make access to internet and to content on the internet much more available for everybody. But I think there are also examples of how Web3 can be deployed even when the beneficiaries, or perhaps, sorry, the bottom of the pyramid type of people involved, don't even have a phone. And I'll give you one example, which is we were doing some work recently for GSMA's Mobile for Development program on digital solutions for plastic waste management. And there was one really interesting company called Banyan Nation in India who we were looking at. And they effectively, they buy waste plastic and they process it and they sell it on to big buyers like IKEA or big kind of automotive manufacturers. And they have a network of people throughout their supply chain. And in the last kind of rung of the ladder, they have a network of aggregators who buy plastic from the kind of street collectors of plastic for a fair price. And all of the transactions from that stage onwards are incorporated into a blockchain, which then makes it a kind of digital fingerprint across the value chain that then makes it possible for the ultimate buyer, the kind of manufacturer who's buying recycled plastic, to have the right kind of due diligence in place to see what happened throughout their supply chain, whether the different waste collectors and aggregators paid a fair wage, and so on. And so I think that's a good example of Web3 technology, blockchain technology, playing a really important role, even though the kind of last rung of the beneficiaries, who are plastic waste collectors who get a fairer, better wage, not having the tech to actually engage themselves. But having said that, there are higher and higher kind of rates of mobile phone penetration and mobile internet use, or there are still very significant gender gaps in many countries. And I think there's also a good opportunity for a bit of leapfrogging for as we've seen in kind of fintech and mobile money, many people across developing countries to enable to access services that can have Web3 technologies in the background, as John was saying, not necessarily knowing kind of what the technology is doing, but just benefiting from the services that are available.
Great, fascinating work. Thank you for sharing all of that. So I'm keen to hear again from Sarah and Alex at Phase 3, our research team. And even just in the past few minutes, we've gone through so many use cases across carbon credits, across education, and thinking about the role that Web3 might have in the future of work, thanks to Bea and her work at the Hungry Lab. You're obviously very interested in the Web3 space at Phase 3, and you're running a hatchery and designing and playing and making with these technologies all the time, but you are specifically interested and focused on decentralized science. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about why DeSci has got your attention and amongst all of this other stuff that you could be doing, and whether for you it connects at all with the future of work. What is the kind of citizen scientist future that you might envisage for us?
Yeah, thank you. It's been a really interesting conversation there about all of this. I do think it definitely does connect to the future of work in terms of empowering more scientists and citizens, the citizen science movement. But yeah, in terms of like what's happening with DeSci and everything around that, I think there's been lots that's been discussed already, which definitely translates well to DeSci. Like I think what John started with around, there's a wide range of stakeholders that you need to coordinate is a great use of blockchain. And I think with science, arguably, I mean, we're all stakeholders here. We all take medicine. We all use science all the time in our everyday lives. So I think blockchain is a really good way of mass coordination for those kinds of stakeholders. But my background is science. So I was actually a neuroscientist before I went into weird and wonderful world of Web3. And I think people are generally quite surprised to learn about the huge inefficiencies in science, and how there's a lot of intermediaries, and obviously blockchain is great at, cutting out unnecessary intermediaries. A lot of the funding is kind of lost. So a lot of funding is from taxpayers, and it gets lost out of the system to, third parties for profit, for example. The collaboration, the coordination of people is really key. And that's how we all ended up with the vaccine, like at speed. And people will be quite surprised to learn that, collaboration can be quite hard in science because of the culture that we have is very toxic, publish or perish. So people aren't necessarily, scientists like to share their work, but they're not exactly incentivized to do so. So there's a lot of blockchain tools which can really help power science and address some of these problems, and citizen science, empowering more people to do more science and rewarding them fairly for doing so is a great use of Web3. And we're definitely seeing that with more and more DeSci projects, whether it's rewarding patients for their data or creating science bounties, and anybody can be a scientist. Essentially, you don't have to have a PhD. Like you just have to be part of a supportive community who can help mentor you to take part in this. And I think more collaborative ownership of science can only be a really good thing when we live in this sort of post-truth era and people are quite distrusting of science. But there's many aspects that Web3 improves. Censorship resistance is a huge one. This idea of data about health and pollution and climate maybe shouldn't necessarily be owned by governments. Maybe it should be owned by the people, because we have I think different administrations have been accused of censorship of science before. Transparency is a huge one as well. Like, we've spoken to people in some countries, and they're really interested in Web3 for DeSci because perhaps the grants from government aren't necessarily making their way to the scientists who they're meant to make their way to. So this idea you can actually track how donations are being spent in individual labs. Lots of things around cutting out the intermediaries, as I said before, and ownership, and this collective ownership, and also data and AI, and that's Alex's specialty, is the data and AI side. But this idea of AI is owned by big tech at the minute, and what if actually you could have more sort of collective ownership of AI and more transparency over the data that goes into AI algorithms and what's behind those AI algorithms as well. So yeah, I think
that was a great point to end on, because I'd love to pick up Rika Amaral, I hope I've said your name correctly, asked about exactly that, like what the big open source database projects on Web3 for impact. So yeah, Alexandra, do you want to pick up on that and share what you know?
So this is actually, I think, one of the most exciting parts of sort of this DeSci movement, is this, how do we open source data, and how do we, and actually John worked on a project called Astral, if he wants to talk about that, looking at geodata, so geospatial data. So I think some of the most exciting projects in this space are looking at how to share data more widely and in a sort of easier manner, because scientists, a lot of the way they share data, which I didn't know before I started working this DeSci space, is they'll go meet in a coffee shop with a hard drive, and that's how they'll physically have to go share the data, because these data sets are so large, it's so difficult to and so expensive to upload them to sort of a cloud provider or whatever it is, and then be able to download them. And there's such large ingress and egress, which basically means the amount you're uploading and downloading. So there's actually projects that are working on this. So one of them is any sort of compute over data project. So there's a project within Protocol Labs called Bacchiao. There's also, Ocean Protocols working on this with their compute to data. So there's a lot of those sorts of projects which are quite exciting in the data space, about how do we openly share data. You can actually freely upload data to IPFS at the moment. So if you want to go and try this out, you can go and do that now. There's also some projects from DeSci Labs who are building DeSci nodes, which are basically on PDFs. You can click on sort of this embedded link, and from there you can see the complete life cycle of how the paper was written and everybody that's contributed to that paper. So that's actually quite an interesting sort of, I guess, use case of Web3, how it's sort of slotting into how we work today, which is we still use PDFs for science. So it's trying to make the jump towards maybe a bit more of a user-friendly experience of consuming this knowledge. Other sort of tools for sharing data in a more open and collaborative way include like data unions and data trusts. So data unions and data trusts could basically take control, like take the sort of responsibility of individual data and being able to share that in a way that individuals agree to. So at the moment, the way that we upload our data is we upload it to the easiest person we can. So whether that's using Google or Chrome, and they collect our user data and they share that how they want to. These data unions and data trusts, we could subscribe to them. So you say like, oh, data union A, I really like how they're, what I agree with the way that they want to go, the way they want to govern my data. Maybe they want to give it to all researchers all over the world, and I agree with that. So I'll entrust my data with data union A. Or maybe you're like, I'm not so sure. I've maybe got this long-term health condition, or I live in a really sort of politically unstable place. So actually, I'm going to subscribe to like data union B, which keeps my data a bit more private. So these are some other ways which some exciting sort of use cases which are already being implemented.
Thank you. And I see that people are pointing out to some interesting topics and projects as well, and sharing them in the chat. Thank you all so much for the fantastic questions and comments in the chat. I've invited the panelists to respond to them all directly, because we're not going to have time to go through all of them. I was wondering, Bian and the Hungry Lab, if we might offer you the final question, which is around whether there is a gap or an opportunity in offering a Web3 translator to people more kind of grassroots, or in the countries that we're interested in low middle income economies. How can we translate some of what's available so that they can make better use of them? And knowing that you train leaders of tomorrow, I'm wondering if this idea from Alejandro resonates for you.
Yeah, actually, there has been a lot going on into the traditional non-Web3 space that we can learn from and take lessons of what's worked into translating into translating for the Web3 technologies. So, for example, one great use case is digital green. So they actually they're in India, and they started out basically doing very localized grassroots training of smallholder farmers on educating on best practices in very local languages. As we know, India has many different types of languages, and a lot of them don't know English. And so they were farmers training farmers in their local language. And they just started using Pico projectors in backyards, in living rooms, in farmers' houses, and it grew and grew and grew, and it became a very large NGO. And so that is something, it doesn't require a lot of fancy technology. The key is to get citizen participation. And once one community got going, then it resonated and it transferred to many, many other communities and started growing organically. And so that's something those are lessons that we should take into Web 3.0, into looking at how can we, the technology is one thing, but then how do you get users at the local grassroots level to adapt and implement it themselves? It has to be a ground up scenario, not a top down. And it was in that case where the citizens actually dictated and determined what information was useful, how they could use it. And it was very, very much open discourse, collaborative, needs-based from the communities themselves. And so that's a critical lesson that we should take into transferring anything we want to do with Web3, working with local communities and local perspectives.
I love that ending note. Thank you so much, because it kind of ties back to exactly what David Woolnough was saying when he opened this symposium and this first day, is that, as we learned in the world of remittances, a lot of that leapfrogging, a lot of that real ingenuity happened in Africa. The mobile banking, remittances, and other things. And I love that you're saying that could be possible for what lies ahead with Web3 as well. A huge thanks to the panelists. A little reminder for everyone who's been following along on YouTube that they will all be in the Microsoft Teams link after the symposium comes to an official close today. If you want to hang out, disagree, nerd out about data unions, you know where to find them. Huge thanks to everyone for taking part.
Thank you to everyone on the panel there. So we open the session ready to move beyond the very hyped sort of binary all or nothing view of Web3 and begin to get into some of the nuance of what might be possible and what early signals we're seeing based on what people are already doing. And I don't know about you, but I've picked up from that discussion and the discussion today, well, a number of interesting insights, actually. One was a big takeaway for me has been that Web3 at its best enables collaboration and communication, sure. But I've also learned, particularly from that panel there, that it's going to require a lot of collaboration and communication too, to build a version that's diverse, and to go back to Melvin Kranzberg's tech laws, you know, a good version of what we'd like to see. And another big takeaway for me is that the moment's really now. In the chat, there was a question from our FCDO colleague, Phil Outram, who was asking if there's a moment where we switch on Web3, which I thought was a great question. And what we've heard is not quite, it's more of an evolution in parallel to Web 2. But today really showed from all those examples that we've heard how it's not just coming, it's also here. You know, we're beginning to experience Web3, sometimes without even knowing it. It may even be behind the scenes. So many examples of how people are already beginning to build, test, and play with these things. So it feels like a real moment in time for all of us to be having this conversation. So I'm sure that you've all gathered sort of points of views, opinions, maybe you have still questions unanswered that you'd like to put to our panelists or to each other. So we're going to be sharing now a Teams link for a space to connect with each other. That's going to be coming up in the chat shortly. So that will be taking place for 15 minutes after this. And just before we go to that chat, for those who'd like to join, first a reminder that tomorrow, for day 2 of our 4-day series, we're going to be speculating about the future. So I'll leave you with a couple of questions ahead of the session tomorrow. What can we take into tomorrow from today when we speculate about the future, and what's still unresolved? So if this was in person, we'd be gathering over a coffee now to meet, chat, swap business cards, whatever it might be, swap views, swap ideas. And so the link is coming at you in the chat for the Teams space to connect with each other. All that's left for me is to say a huge thank you to each of our speakers today. And thanks to every one of you for joining us, for coming along to listen, ask brilliant questions and learn from each other. If you're able to join the Teams chat, the room's open now for you to connect with each other and discuss everything you've heard. If you're not joining, we hope to see you tomorrow, same time, same place. So that's 1 p.m. till 3 p.m. GMT here on YouTube Live. Thank you and goodbye.